Hey everyone, welcome back to our Trippy Book Club where we're reading Shattered Silence, The Untold Story of a Serial Killer's Daughter by Melissa G. Moore. And as a reminder, my Trippy tribe picked this book because Melissa G. Moore is the face behind the, I guess you can say, fame of Gypsy Rose Blanchard right now. And this is why we decided to read this. So I hope you guys are all caught up. I have posted chapters 1 through 6 are up now. We are going to be on chapter 7 right now. And like I said, I'm reading about 3 or 4 chapters each time. I will be posting 2 times a week until we are done with the book. And then once we are done with the book, I'll give you guys an opportunity to listen to its entirety, and we actually discuss it over on my TikTok account. So go and check out my TikTok account. If you guys are not already following, follow me. If for any reason we read this after the April 6th date of the extension of TikTok, which that's still hanging in the balance for us Americans, I will be doing the reading over either here on live on YouTube or over on Instagram. So be sure you're following all my socials. I also want to remind you guys really quickly that I am starting a new podcast. It's called Blurred Lines, and basically we talk about the same things we talk about on all my other channels: true crime, conspiracy theories, and some gossip. And of course, we know that those lines get blurred between all three. Sometimes we can talk about all of them. Sometimes it's just true crime and gossip. Sometimes it's a little bit of conspiracy, you know what I mean? So if you guys don't mind, I do have a playlist here on YouTube for my podcast, and I will be dropping the first episode on February 18th, so next Tuesday. So be sure you guys are subscribed. It is not available on all platforms yet, but you can listen on Amazon Music as well as Spotify. So I hope you guys subscribe to me. Let's get to it so we can get through this. I'm hoping I'm not getting sick because my son is currently sick, and I'm hoping I'm not, but we are going to try to get through this. So here we go. Chapter 7, The New Game. It was so sudden and unexpected. One moment I was safe in my bed in the hills of Yakima, in a loving home with a mom and dad next to caring grandparents. Then abruptly I was driving with my mother, brother, and sister into absolutely unknown territory, far from anything we had known before. After leaving our home, we stopped to get. So I think I read this already. Hold on, guys. One moment. Alright guys, so I apologize. So it looks like I had read chapters 5, 6, and 7 last time. So I'm actually on chapter 8. So I believe the first video in this playlist, I read 4 chapters instead of 3. So that's where I got confused. So we are on chapter 8, and it's New Discoveries, New Hope. The next morning as Dad left, I thought I was being torn in 2 pieces. Dad had wrestled with us, played games, and taken the 3 of us out to eat at a local truck stop. Mom didn't come. "Why don't you stay here?" I pleaded to my father when we were eating. "You and Mom can work this out." "Laura will never forgive me," he replied. His head hung low. Even though he didn't believe it would work, I could tell he was truly thinking about it. Surely being around all of us was enough to want us back, wasn't it? I tried a new tact. "We need you, Daddy," I said. Rarely did I call him by that name anymore, usually thinking I was too grown up for it. "Mom needs you." He was silent for a long time, and it made Jason and Carrie nervous, but I didn't care. I wanted him to hurt enough to come back to us, to see that we needed him. A few minutes later, he changed the subject, and our conversation was all but forgotten. I wanted to cry. When Dad dropped us back at Grandma's, I wasn't the only one begging. The 3 of us clung to his legs in desperation. "Please don't leave, Daddy," cried Carrie. Jason and I both hung on silently. I had already given my argument, but the tears streaming down my face were surely worth something. Our father untangled us, got into his vehicle, and disappeared down the road. The man that always bragged he was the best dad in the world had left us. I could tell it was breaking his heart too, but not enough to come back to us. Not enough. A few short days later, my mother announced she had enrolled us in a school in Spokane. Despite what I had experienced with my dad, I was surprised to hear that I would be staying longer, so long that I needed to go to school there. Disappointment welled up inside me like a huge rock on my chest. We would have to stay in our grandmother's home while we attended school. She didn't really have room for us, and our little space in the dank darkness of the basement was less than cheerful. It was one thing to spend a summer camping out, playing outside in the sun all day. That was livable. But to suddenly realize that I would have to sleep on an uncomfortable cot in the corner of the basement with shoeboxes for drawers for days on end seemed to douse any flame of happiness that I had mustered at this point. Plus, I didn't have any supplies that a normal home would have, or even my own desk to do homework. I felt unprepared. Even though my father had brought many of our belongings up from Yakima, I was still missing so much, and there was no room to put it all anyway. To put it all anyway, yeah. So we hear here about, their more permanent move, and we hear about a visit. So now we hear about one visit again. Melissa right now is around 8 or 9, around there. So she still really doesn't understand what's happening or grasping what exactly is going on, only that her parents, are obviously fighting about something and something is not right, and having that feeling inside of her. Despite my misgivings, I began attending Evergreen Elementary a few weeks later. I walked into my classroom with my head held high, but inside my stomach was turned inside out. Surely all these people could see my insecurities stamped across my forehead. My earlier love for learning forgotten. I expected that my teacher would be mean and boring, and that life would be completely sucked of all joy. I was surprised to find out that my teacher was a tall, blonde, athletic man. I was even more surprised as he began to engage with our entire class, getting to know us an easygoing, laid-back style that was so much more inspiring than controlling. A coach and a teacher, he was passionate in working with children, and his positive energy rubbed off on us quickly. One of the first things he inspired us to do was to dream big. He asked us to write an essay about what we wanted to do when we grew up. He encouraged us to write as if we had no limitations, none. What would we be? At first, everyone talked about things their parents did and the kinds of jobs they were familiar with. But as the teacher engaged us, he extracted our dreams and our desires. I couldn't believe it. This exercise was so much fun. I drew a long limousine and wrote about being a movie star. Many of my classmates were similarly inspired, and some drew astronauts and presidents. So isn't that interesting that Melissa G. Moore aspired to be a movie star in a limousine? I would say so. It was such a liberating feeling to dream. All of a sudden, I felt like I really could be anything, have anything, that I was only limited by my imagination. For the first time, I had a tool to deal with the uncertainty of the future. And just by making today better, I was equally excited to see what I could embrace in new days to come. I began to feel alive, and hope started to spring within me. At first, I hoped for my parents to get back together. Then it was to live as a family. Then it was to have our own home. Some of these thoughts and emotions seem unrealistic and childish, and yet I realized that they were the hope that was keeping me going, keeping me alive inside. I didn't realize how much of a role these dreams would play in my own future. As much as I loved my new teacher, I found fitting in to this new school was much harder than it had been in Yakima. In my old school, I was equal to everyone. Everyone was equal to everyone. Here it seemed very different. The first thing I noticed, especially because people noticed it about me and pointed it out, was that my clothes did not meet the expensive standards that society seemed to have set. In addition to that, I did not have involved parents who would support school activities like PTA or Girl Scouts. That also meant I did not have a group to fit into like everyone else seemed to have. During recess, I used all kinds of tactics to avoid other kids, since they had tendencies to tease me and would be incredibly cruel. One day the boys wanted to play dodgeball on the brick wall. My neighborhood friend Sarah had a different group she liked to play with at school. They played a game on the asphalt called Foursquare the whole time, and I was never invited. They made it very clear that I was not equal to them. I was pleasantly surprised when one girl began to gravitate toward me. Her name was Kimberly, and she had kinky, wavy hair, braces, and 2 dimples when she smiled really wide. Kimberly and I would go to the top of this small hill where all the pine trees were and play house. I would make walls out of pine needles and make lines in the dirt for kitchen, including tables and chairs, as well as the rest of the house. We had great fun. One weekend, Kimberly invited me to her home. I accepted. She had the same kind of dolls that my cousin did, American Girl dolls. In fact, she had the entire Samantha collection with a table, tea set, and a chest for Samantha's Victorian clothes. I had so much fun playing, but the longer we played, the more clear it became that I would never own one of these dolls, much less an entire set. I suddenly felt very inferior, and it made me sad that I was even inferior to the only girl I had connected with at school. So we go into, again, Melissa Moore is around 8 or 9 at this time. We go into her not being accepted. And it sounds like to me she's not accepted, not because of just her clothes, but it seems to me like she's more of an innocent soul than a lot of the other kids that are around. And it seems like people see that she's innocent or she has some intuition. Again, this is just kind of what I'm seeing just from what I'm reading right now. And it also sets forth that envious tone that we see just now and we see with people she's chose to associate with as well now in her real life, you know what I mean? If you know, you know, pretty much. During the school year, my father made another surprise visit to Carrie, Jason, and me. He said he simply couldn't come to Spokane without checking on his kids, which made us feel a little better. We didn't know he would be coming, so even though his visit was brief, since he was only waiting for a load to pick up, we were pleased and excited to see him. Dad had more expendable income than Mom and proved to be generous on the occasion of his visits. So I saw this as an opportunity to get at least 1 or 2 items that I needed in order to fit in. My father seemed to know how difficult it was to fit in at school. Eventually, he had developed thick skin, he said, but I had been unable to do that yet. As the school year had progressed, it had become more and more apparent that there was a huge gap between the discount clothing I wore and the designer labels worn by the majority of the school. I had heard from my mother and father that clothes didn't make the man, but I saw how it certainly contributed. When I was walking down the hall the first day of school, every butt had a yellow guess triangle on the pocket. Everyone except mine, that is. I don't see Spokane being this rich, I guess you would say. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but if any of you guys know, let me know down in the comments. But it seems like she's emphasizing, I know there's periods of times where, you know, your clothes and all this stuff, especially in high school, middle school, all that stuff is like that. But I don't know, this just seems a little bit out there again, thinking that she is in elementary school still. She's not yet in middle or high school. So I digress. While Dad was there on his short visit, he agreed to take us on a little shopping excursion. We had a great time at the mall, and I worked him over really good for a pair of $60 Guess jeans. That was more money than I was given to spend on my entire wardrobe that year. But I was dying for a pair so I would feel like I could fit in. Dad knew it was expensive, but he bought them to please me. We shopped for Jason and Carrie and had a lot of fun that day at the mall. We went out to eat and did lots of other enjoyable things together. We thought about going to the movies, but Dad was low on cash. When we stopped at the ATM machine, all of a sudden the energy around my father shifted. His body froze and I saw him grow instantly angry. He looked at us with the coldest look that I had ever seen in my life. "What's the matter, Dad?" I asked, trying to still the tremor in my voice. "Did something happen?" There was a long pause. "Did something happen?" he asked, his voice menacing. "You happened. I'm nothing but a paycheck to you kids. You know what when I come, I have money. So I pick up you kids and you suck me completely dry." His voice had risen sharply, and he didn't seem to care that everyone nearby was watching, their eyes wide as ours. "You're a bunch of ungrateful, selfish kids. You don't give a shit what I do to provide for you." I could feel this getting out of control really fast. Carrie had started to cry, and Jason's face had lost all its color. Something had to be done fast. "You're right, Dad," I said, quickly looking at the ground with my head down. "You're absolutely right. We are selfish. I'm selfish. I asked you to buy me these jeans. I had no right to do that. I wanted them, and I used you as a way to get them. I'm sorry, and I want to take them back." The other two followed my lead. "Yeah, Dad, we just want to take our stuff back." Dad looked at us for a moment, the anger still raging in his eyes. We didn't do anything, didn't argue. Our heads hung low in submission. We waited. It took a moment, but I saw my dad take a breath, and then he began to melt, just a little. The cold man he had become warmed a little when we agreed with him and said he was right. We had learned that if we played by the rules, his anger would dissipate faster and no one would get hurt. After the shopping trip was over, I was relieved that my father's trip was a brief one. I had seen him talk and act that way to our mom, but usually not to us. Although money was always a big cause of stress for him, when he called to check up on us later in the week, he acted like nothing had ever happened. We see now for the first time that, again, at older ages is when he's showing kind of his true colors. And this just also goes to show that they were trying to please their father just as much as he was trying to cover up and please them. But it also shows that I don't see this happening the way it did. I see it more or less happening a little more, I guess it would be more drawn out than what's explained here, is what I see it happening as. Now, very well, we don't know who Melissa Moore was when she was a child. She could have been very well spoken like that, but we don't know. But we do see this first instance, so it's not like this was something that's been happening since they were born. This is the first instance that he has done this and verbally abused them so far. As it came closer to the holidays, my mother was struggling to make ends meet. I knew I wouldn't be getting any designer clothes or toys soon, but more important was the fact that I couldn't help but feel incredibly lonely. That entire summer and fall, I had not heard from my family in Yakima. That was probably one of the hardest things of all to face. I felt left out of my own family. I didn't understand why none of the Jespersons had called or even written a letter, but I had the excuse in my head that they did not know how to reach me. When I let myself relive past times, I missed my grandmother Lucy and her mashed potatoes and cinnamon rolls. Even more, I missed her easygoing, fun-loving manner. I missed Grandpa and the tender way he would treat me. I missed playing with my cousins and telling stories to my aunts and uncles. I had been waiting for them to make the first connection, and it did not come until my father connected us together again. The only communication I had to the close family came through my dad on the phone. He started letting us know what everyone was up to, and this filled a deep hole inside of me. "Grandpa and Grandma want you to know they miss you and they love you," he said, and my heart swelled with pain and happiness at the same time. I missed them more than I could say, especially to my dad. If he was irritated with Grandpa, he wouldn't tell me much about them or their lives. If he was in a good mood, they were getting along well, he would give me more details that made me feel like I was still connected, almost right next door. Again, the hope flared within me and I would be with my family. Again, the hope flared within me that I could be with my family and that we could be whole. Okay, so we hear a little bit more stories and we hear a little bit more instances. So again, building up to that point, where possibly this goes overboard or whatever. You know what I mean? So, okay. Chapter 9, The Whispered Prayer. Late in September, I got off the phone with Dad, and my emotions were all over the place. I went outside to breathe in the cool, fresh air and enjoy the grass for a little longer. It was getting colder, and I wondered what the weather would be like in the winter. Did it even snow in Spokane? I tried to empty my mind and concentrate on the dry grass between my toes. But my mind was whirling. It seemed like Dad was more and more irritated with Grandpa all the time. I realized that if I listened to everything he said, I would easily hate my own grandfather. I knew Grandpa was strong-willed and often pushed people to their limits. He was also generous, a genius that invented things, that thought up new ideas constantly, could build just about anything, and enjoyed it when people around him knew how brilliant he was. I think that was irritating to my father, who seemed to also be quite brilliant, though Grandpa acted as if he was slow and even stupid sometimes. I didn't like how my grandfather treated my father, and it seemed different from how he treated his other two sons. Sometimes my grandfather teased my mother unrelentingly too. Still, my Grandpa Roy had often shown me his tender, loving side. When I was younger, he would pick me up and take me places, drive me around on his four-wheeler, and teach me things about life, nature, and what made things work. With all my heart, I missed him, and I wished I could see him again. I also had a feeling that Grandpa was disappointed in Dad and was getting after him for leaving us to be with Tony. I hoped that was the case and that Dad would listen to him. Somehow I knew, however, that whatever Grandpa said made him want to do the opposite even more. Observing my father and his family made me wonder about my mom and her own family's dynamics. She was very loving and caring deep inside, but she had been through a lot and was doing her best to survive in this brand new situation. After being married for 13 years, primarily being a mother and homemaker, she had been forced to work for the first time since she was a teenager. I could tell from the bags under her eyes and the extra work she took on to try to make ends meet that this was all very hard on her. What made it challenging for me was that Mom would never talk about it, not one word. She wouldn't discuss any feelings or issues unless it was to say that we couldn't afford to buy something that we might want. As I observed my mother interact with her siblings and her own mother, I realized that she had learned from her family not to talk about issues or express emotions. My mother's side of the family didn't hug, greet one another with enthusiasm, or say I love you. It just was the way it was. And although they cared about one another deeply, their circumstances growing up reinforced this dynamic. My mom was raised in a Byzantine Catholic home in Indiana. She was completely surrounded by family, including 15 cousins close to her age that she spent most of her time with. They all went to church together every Sunday, and my mother grew up very sheltered. She had been taught that you get married, you had children, and you stayed together for the rest of your life. My mother didn't know of any other way to live until a tragedy happened in their family. When my mom was just 7, her mother gave birth to an infant son, and the family rejoiced. However, he contracted hepatitis from the hospital and died 2 weeks later. Wow. His death had a terrible, traumatic effect on the family. Apparently, my grandfather became an alcoholic and was never able to resolve his grief. After 3 years of struggling to make their marriage work, my grandmother had to divorce him and live on her own. This was particularly difficult during a time of horrendous social stigma for a single divorced mother, especially one with 6 children. It was also very difficult for my mother to have her father suddenly leave. For more than a decade, her family never heard a thing from him, and it was hard to be estranged from much of the family life she had known for so long. So it's kind of astounding to think that Melissa's life is turning out like her mother's life. A lot of similarities, a lot of tragedy, a lot of things that they have to do in order to continue life. Very interesting. My grandmother My grandmother did what she could to survive and carry on. It made her tough and resilient, but emotionally unavailable to her children. Now I witnessed my mother going through the same thing. I knew it had to be difficult for her. The last thing she had been expecting was a sudden divorce, to be abruptly left on her own and having to rely on her mother, again, for support and assistance. Still, she would not speak about it at all. Jason, Carrie, and I knew nothing of her inner struggles, her thoughts, or emotions. I thought that would all change, but as time went on, she seemed even more withdrawn from us. That's so sad because like she she was obviously struggling on her own, but also she had this inkling of what was going on, and I think her mom knew that this went beyond like cheating as to what her dad was doing. You know what I mean? Idly, I watched people in my neighborhood in their daily activities, taking out the trash, interacting with their children, talking and laughing, going to work and coming home. I had been an observer of people since I was very young. Although I didn't have much variation to witness in the rural areas of Tapanash and Yakima, I had always enjoyed seeing the limited but somewhat varied ways of life around me. Now I began to pay close attention to the behavior of many other families and individuals. What made them different from each other? Why did people have different levels of abundance and show such varied signs of affection? Why did some people seem genuinely happy, others appear superficially happy, and still others appear to be cut off, disconnected, or even miserable? I thought again about my father. He said he had chosen to be with Tony because she made him happy. Why hadn't he been happy enough with me, with his beloved Jason and Carrie, the little girl he adored, with my mom? Fiercely I pulled up tufts of the drying grass and ripped them apart. When I threw the pieces as hard as I could with every angry thought, I pulled more, making an ugly bare spot in the ground. It reflected the angry questions in my mind. If being with Tony made my father happy enough to leave us, then why did he act so miserable on the phone? Why did he spend so much resenting energy complaining about Grandpa? I didn't know the answers to any of my questions, and it made me feel more and more angry with myself and with the world. Just then, the sounds of laughter and singing caught my attention. Bitterly, I swung my head toward the origin of sound. A car was rounding the bend to go down our street. It was packed with 5 or 6 people, and everyone inside was laughing and noisily singing together to a song on the radio. That is, everyone except one person in the back. This young man stood out in stark contrast in his silence, looking morosely out the window. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I couldn't help but shiver as we both looked away. I knew it was no accident that I had connected with him. I did not want to be that person, and yet that's how I felt. Left out by my father. Left out from the people I loved in Yakima. Left out emotionally from my closeness to my family here. Left out by the friends from my neighborhood. Once I got to school because I wasn't good enough. This time I whispered, I do not want to be that person. How can I live my life differently so that I can be happy? Really happy. Once again, I didn't know the answer to my question. This time, however, as I whispered it to the wind, it felt almost as if I had turned into a sacred prayer. I felt it rise into the sky. So, now we kind of hear a little bit more of, the emotions going through her. Again, I don't really see maybe almost 9-10-year-old feeling this much emotions, but again, I that's just my opinion, and the way I see it is, I don't really know how fast she did actually grow up, or how it's just the thing is it's very contradicting to have such a childlike spirit but be so adult. You don't genuinely see those two coincide you know, back to back. She's very childlike in a lot of things, but then reverts to being very, very adult like in the way she's thinking or the way she's portraying things. And that could just be what her memory is, because now she's an adult, she can't think like a kid again. But it's just my opinion. Something I've noticed in reading this is like you get an innocence that kind of draws you in, that manipulation portion, and then you get the seriousness of something that doesn't come from that age group. And again, this is something we see with Gypsy Rose Blanchard in her book, that we see a lot of back and forth, a lot of this happened, you know, from the top, go to the bottom, and then we go back to the top again. A lot of things that make us question the how valid this stuff really is. Again, trauma, things like that. Me personally, this is only my personal situation, is I am a product of divorce, and I've dealt with divorce, very messy divorce. And I can tell you that I don't remember things that vividly when my dad would visit, or when we left, or, you know, anything like that. Like, I don't remember things that vividly, and it seems like I don't think, especially somebody that has been through exponentially more trauma, to not remember that, remembers a lot of this stuff. So we are going to read chapter 10. I'm going to be right back, and we're going to read chapter 10. Hey everyone, welcome back. Sorry I had to do a little cut there. I got cold, so put on my sweater. But we are going to continue reading Shattered Silence. We're on chapter 10, Holidays Without Home. One day after school, I trudged into my grandmother's neighborhood. Feeling as bleak and colorless as my surroundings, I couldn't help but see the major transition that had taken place in the last few days. Most people had taken down all of their lights and decorations from the Christmas holiday, and we were all back at school. Instead of pure white snow, the ground was dull and gray, mirroring the sky. I watched a lone leaf fluttering in the icy wind, the last on the bare branch of one tree. I had figured that holidays here would be a little different from what I was used to, but I found each development more depressing than exciting. Normally, I was intrigued by seeing how people celebrated differently than my family and I. This year, it just seemed everything shouted out, declaring everything I did not have. During the month of October, the whole neighborhood had been transformed into Halloween haven. There were decorations as most of the houses. Some of them were fun, and some were incredibly gory and creepy. I usually liked Halloween, but I had never experienced one that felt so weird and disconnected. Every advertisement on the radio and television seemed to call out family fun. Our father was a huge Halloween fan, and it was hard not to see him during his favorite holiday. 200 miles was not that far away for a trucker, but since it was in the opposite direction of Dad's work, that meant we rarely got to see him. In previous years during Halloween, our mother had preferred to stay home, while our father would dress up and take us out for hours and hours and hours until we dropped. We loved trick-or-treating, and the mounds of treasures we would go home with would last for months. Carrie and Jason were especially disappointed not to see Dad, and we all went our separate ways with different friends for trick-or-treating. So again, emphasizing some things that happened when her dad was around as opposed to when he's not around, and kind of making it more gloomy that he's not around compared to like if he was. Kind of weird to me. Just kind of weird. When Christmas rolled around, it became especially hard on all of us. It was like the world we had always known just simply didn't exist. Christmas was Dad's second favorite holiday and my most favorite of all. One year at Grandpa's house, I had found a Santa suit and dressed up in it, pillow, tummy, beard, and all, and walked around pretending to be old Saint Nick. Everyone laughed. I didn't understand all of the nativity things about Christmas, but the Jaspersons didn't really celebrate that part of it anyway. What I knew was that I loved being around family more than life. As a child, of course, I loved the presents, but they seemed to mean so much more when we were all enjoying them together. It was depressing to me to know that all our cousins would be opening their gifts and then be meeting at Grandpa's house for dinner. Lucy would make her signature potatoes and rolls and yummy desserts. Then they would get their four-wheelers and go sledding on the big mountains of snow and play games like King of the Hill. Jason usually won, even if he wasn't the oldest. He was often the strongest. Since my mother's family was not overtly social like the Jaspersons, we didn't do much for the holiday season except go to St. Thomas Catholic Church with grandmother Frances for Christmas Day. Jason, Carrie, and I became incredibly homesick. Now, walking into my grandfather's front walk, I paused for a moment, looking at the house. I didn't feel comfortable calling it home. It was her house, after all. I didn't feel right to call it ours. In addition, I was somehow under the delusion that if I never called it home, somehow or another, we would get out of there to have a place to call our own. Every day it felt like we were visitors, no long-term campers, especially sleeping on a cot in my little nook of the basement. So, I mean, it seems like they're pretty homesick, but again, coming from somebody that suffered from, came from a family of divorce and all of that, this is all pretty normal when you go through it. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people can attest to that, like your first holidays and your first like times away from them, especially if they were the majority family you spent with during the holidays. It does get depressing and sad, and you do get homesick, depending on also if you stay in your home state or if you have to move and things like that. So this is something kids go through. Like if you can take away divorce, you can take away this kind of thing kids go through. But this is normal. This is completely normal. I didn't know that until after I grew up and started hearing from people that had divorces before. But again, even the sleeping in a little nook of the basement, that's something you have to deal with. I remember I lived with my auntie for a period of time and didn't have my own room. It's something you just have to deal with when you're going through something with a single mom that has to rebuild their life pretty much. It's just something you go through. The house was tiny and looked like one or two people might live there comfortably, but certainly not 5 or 6. Since it was only 300 square feet, when I walked into the house, I had to be careful not to push the door in too hard. It led right into the kitchen, which was also next to the stairs. If anyone was standing there, it could knock them down. The kitchen was covered in 1960s laminate and tile, and there was a wooden banister between the kitchen and the stairwell. There was a plywood shelf above the stairwell, and the light from the kitchen gave minimal light for going up and down the stairs. Surprisingly, there was a small entrance to a tiny dining room and the front room, which was covered in burgundy-colored marble carpeting. All the walls in the house were white, except for the dining area, which featured diagonal wood paneling. In the front room, where there were floral couches set low to the ground and one little chair where if you pushed the arm, the leg came up. I made my way down to the small staircase and over to the corner of the basement. Dumping my backpack on the cot, I reached up and pulled down the string for the light. The naked bulb shone bleakly in the dark dinginess of the tiny space. Our boxes with most of our precious possessions stood stacked together in one corner, waiting for the day we could have a place of our own. In my corner, I had stacked shoe boxes, which acted like a dresser for me. At least it was neat and tidy, keeping items off the cold cement floor. Happy that the only homework I had was reading, I turned to go, pulling on the light cord. The entire basement went dark, since the light was fading fast outside. As quickly as I could, I made my way up the stairs and outside, stopping to breathe in the crisp, clean air. I hadn't realized I was holding my breath. I searched the neighborhood for a sign of life, but everyone had gone inside to play. I had to get a playmate quickly or I'd be stuck home. So I set out to knock on a couple of neighbors' doors, wondering who might take me in for the evening. Another so bit went by, and another school day was dawning as my mother came into my room and woke me up to get ready. The weather was still bland and cold in Spokane, but now there was fresh new snow covering our four-square chalk outline in the street. That meant there was no point in getting ready fast. Sarah and I would be able to play a game before the bus came. Sarah lived right across the street in a tiny blue house that was square in shape like ours. Most of the military 50s homes in the neighborhood were similar in size and shape. Sarah had a sister named Stacy that would follow her around all the time. It was annoying to us when just the two of us wanted to hang out. Sometimes it made me grateful that Jason and Carrie didn't do the same thing. Most of the time, however, I secretly missed our camaraderie and especially Jason's adventures. Sarah's parents were divorced and her father never came to visit her and Stacy. I thought I had a better deal since my father made it a point to come visit at least every 3 months or so. Carrie made him promise he would be out for her birthday, so we only had 2 more months before we would see him again. Having my father visit was the only thing in my life that I believed that I actually had better than Sarah. See, she met a girl that is exactly like her, going through same struggles. I did my best not to judge Sarah, but I thought she had it better than me. For one thing, she was popular in 6th grade, more fashionable clothes, and was athletic, so she was always picked for teams. We were in different classes during the afternoon, so we had other friends to play with at recess, and I could tell that also made her more comfortable. Sarah and I would ride the bus home together with our good friend Katie. We did not play with Katie after school on most days because she either had piano lessons or she would have her dad pick her up. Katie's parents were divorced as well, but her family was so different from mine. Her life was incredibly structured. Besides her lessons and visits, it was a mystery to me how her mom would be home to have fresh baked snacks for her and her sister right after school. If her mom was staying at home, even though she was divorced, how could she afford not to work? So again, we're going through, there's a lot of kids and stuff. Now, this is an interesting fact to me, and I don't know if it's true. I didn't grow up in the era where middle school had like recess. But she's saying she's in 6th grade, which in my area, 6th grade is middle school. And she's saying that they don't play during recess because they're in different classes. Well, middle school, you have different classes. And generally, middle school, you don't have recess. So that's kind of fishy to me. I digress. On my better off scale, Katie had it better off than Sarah and me both. Her mom was attentive and at home when her kids needed her. Their home was always clean and decorated with pictures of the girls on the walls, along with pictures of their LDS temple. Katie's family was Mormon, and I had little understanding of the religion. I had been baptized in the Catholic Church back in Yakima, but I knew very little from my own church. I could remember my first communion. It took place just a year before my parents had separated. On weeknights with other children my same age, I'd take lessons at the church. Remembering the Lord's Prayer by heart was our main objective. I struggled to memorize the lengthy prayer without faults. Parents of my classmates would try not to giggle as I would recite my version of the prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. I didn't understand why he was not in heaven. The Lord's Prayer did not make sense to me, but understanding it mattered little as long as I earned the opportunity to go to downtown Yakima to pick out a frilly white dress. Being able to wear my communion dress made it worth memorizing the agonizing long prayer. On my communion day, not only did the white lacy dress look beautiful, but I also got to wear a matching tiara that I had picked out. I looked like a child bride. In my mind, I was a princess. Now that we were in Spokane, my mother did not bring us to any Catholic churches except the one day at Christmas time. Looking up at the cross and seeing an emaciated, bloody, dying figure, Jesus and God, seemed to just blur a blur of confusion to me. In addition, I thought they would probably not care about me or my problems because Jesus had it so much worse. He was hung on a cross. In all my hopelessness, I believe that there was no one I could turn to for comfort. So I don't know. I feel like that's like weird to like lay off like I don't know. I just feel like there is more behind that. Like from a person, I grew up Catholic. Um, I didn't have my first Holy Communion, but I did go to classes for it because that's when my anxiety started acting up. And I can tell you, they make sure that you have a really good understanding of what you're going to communion for. You know what I mean? So that's kind of weird to me too, the whole strict Catholic thing, but not. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's weird. From my front window, I saw the rumbling bus come around the corner. Running to catch it as fast as I could without winter boots, I carefully hopped from one foot to the other in my old white sneakers. My brother and sister followed in my tracks so that their own sneakers wouldn't get wet too. Every day, we made sure we made it to the bus on time. If we didn't, we would have to stay home alone in the boring house. There were not many material things to entertain us, and certainly no cable television. As the bus rumbled off to pick up more kids down the street, I looked back at my grandmother's house. Another reason I had for believing that our yellow home on Norden Street could only be temporary was because my mother did not hang one single item on the cement walls. Not one calendar, not one holiday decoration. Even though I was grateful for the temporary fill, the lack of decoration gave the basement a feeling of coldness. That part I didn't like. I wanted a home like Katie's, warm and decorated with dry flowers and pictures and holiday cheer all year round. I thought of how wonderful it would feel to come home to fresh baked cookies after school like she did. I forgot that there was a time when my mother did something similar to that in our home in Yakima. That seems such a long time ago now, and as I settled in my seat on the bus, I settled for a brief fantasy that this bus was going to my old elementary school in Yakima, that I would get to play with my old friends there, and that I would return at night to my entire family. So it sounds to me like she lives like in this fantasy world of let's just pretend everything's okay. And it is a characteristic of her father because her father, from what I have been watching in documentaries and in movies and things portrayed, her father did similar things after he did stuff that he regretted. He kind of went with the norm. He went and saw his children, so this is very similar to what her father was doing. Very similar. Kind of creepy similar, in my opinion. But winter in Spokane dragged on, pressing slowly, but finally it began to warm. And soon enough, it was Carrie's birthday. We drove down to Yakima and had a party for her in mid March 1990 at Grandma Lucy's house. She had made Carrie a beautiful Barbie cake, and we played with our cousins like old times. For the first time, with all of my aunties and uncles and cousins around, I noticed how big and strong my father really was. When I was little, I thought almost all men were so tall that their heads touched the ceiling. Of course, this was due to my small perspective. As I grew, I realized that this phenomenon was not true of 98.5% of men. My dad, however, absolutely still fit the bill. He stood 6'6" tall and weighed 240 pounds in his leanest form, so he really was huge. Most men looked like children next to him. My cousins and uncles roughhoused together as usual. Dad loved to tickle me because I was incredibly sensitive and would erupt into uncontrollable giggles. He would pin my arms back and tickle my armpits while I was screaming, begging for him to stop. I could tell that he enjoyed me pleading for him to stop and liked the feeling of being in control. I would do everything I could to wiggle out of his grip, but he was far too strong. Finally, I told him I was going to pee my pants. Only when I convinced him that I really was going to wet myself did he finally let me go. So that's turning something innocent that you've probably always done into something foreboding. and something that's leading into something bad, which is awkward. Again, very awkward. Things were feeling almost like old times when chaos erupted. It seemed like Grandpa couldn't help lecturing my father about what he was doing wrong. And the night ended badly again. Another special occasion with family ended awkwardly. The next holiday weekend was Easter, and my grandparents made the effort to come and see us. It was the first time any family besides my father had come to spend time with us in Spokane, and I was so happy. Our previous Easter traditions involved handmade woven fabric baskets that Grandma Gladys had made us. Mine was pink, white with eyelet lace around it. Jason's was gray, blue, and red and looked like a patchwork quilt, lined inside with soft silk. Carrie's basket was yellow with pretty lace. Every year, we would open our door and see our baskets full of treats and chocolate bunny and one special gift. Always dressed in our Sunday best, we would attend the Catholic Church for Easter Sunday, and it was a one time each year that Dad would actually go. Mom always allowed me to put on her very special Mary Kay lip gloss, and I remembered feeling on top of the world. This year, when Easter morning dawned, Carrie received a great big pink rabbit that she named Fufu, with whom she became inseparable. There was no room for Grandpa Roy and Lucy at our grandmother's house, so they had rented a room at a local hotel. Instead of church, we were able to swim at the hotel and bask in the company of our beloved grandparents. As I floated on my back, I studied all the adults while they watched us carefully and chatted. I couldn't figure out why they couldn't just fix the whole messy situation between my mom and dad and make it all better. It seemed so simple to me, and I felt like they made everything complex and impossible. All too soon, it was time to leave and say our tearful goodbyes. Not only was I disappointed that we had to leave them, I hated leaving their warm embraces to go back to the real world, which had begun to seem like a mysterious and frightening place. Okay, so again, chapter 10, a lot of fantasy, a lot of things that are normal but were made to perceive as not being normal, because if you don't come from that background, you kind of wouldn't understand. And again, a lot of up talking her father and the family and all of that stuff. Now the next chapter 11 is called Manipulation, and I'm going to go ahead and read that as well. Guys, so final chapter for today is chapter 11. It's called Manipulation. We didn't see much of our father for a while. His employment was better now. So when he would roll into town, our mother called him Disneyland Dad, because it would be like a big party. We would run screaming to greet him, jumping up and down until it was our turn for a big hug, or to be picked up and spun around the yard like an airplane. That feat was no big deal for him, and he played for a couple hours and let us talk his ear off until it was time to go out together. It was always a new adventure: roller skating, going to the movies, or on the water slides, all the things we couldn't afford to do on a daily basis. He would also buy us necessities like underwear and socks, as well as other vital items that, although might not have been considered necessities in the normal spectrum of survival, were absolute necessities of social survival in the jungle of Spokane School. Dad put some mysterious monetary limit on what we would spend, but to us it felt like Christmas every time he took us out. He was disappointed and frustrated to see that we were losing weight, and he would often spend as much as several $100s on groceries to fill our empty cupboards and bellies before he left. The next time Dad rolled into town, it was early morning. He took us to breakfast, and the smell of bacon cooking was heavenly. It seemed like years since we had enjoyed bacon. We talked with Dad about the day's events and planned out what we wanted to do. I hovered on the outskirts of the discussion, feeling a little cautious and also not wishing to take away from Jason and Carrie, wanting to create for the day. To me, it was enough for us to be together. Not only was it a rare treat to be with our dad, it was also a rare treat for my siblings and I to spend the day together. Our lives had gone in multiple directions and all away from each other. My father seemed to sense my aloofness and paid an extraordinary amount of attention to me. At times that took me by surprise, and sometimes it really bugged me. As we drove from place to place, he asked how school was and what particular subjects I was most interested in, and about my friends. We arrived at Bowl and Pitcher Park to spend part of the day. There was a suspension bridge that we loved to go on, for it was no ordinary bridge. Underneath its large span, the Spokane River raged. Dad knew I was deathly afraid of heights, so I made him promise not to tease me on the bridge. The day was cloudless and lovely, and I was enjoying the sun and the spray of the water as we made our way across the bridge. Jason had already gone far ahead, and Carrie was right after him, as usual. When I was in the middle of the bridge at the unstable area, I suddenly felt the bridge dip and sway. I shrieked in terror, clinging to the railings. I turned my head to see my father bouncing up and down, chuckling. Screaming, I begged him to stop as the bridge swayed and bowed dramatically under the weight of his strong and heavy body. The huge white caps from the river sprayed mist on my face. He wouldn't stop, and as my hands and feet slipped on the watery board and railings, I literally thought I was going to be flung off and fall to my death in the turbulent water below. When he finally stopped, I could not wait to get to the other side. Still, he bounced a couple. Angry and yet still fearful for my life, I finally made it off the bridge and fell onto my knees, grateful for solid earth below me. Dad was still chuckling as he came up behind me. I couldn't help but wonder why my father seemed to like tormenting me. I wondered why it seemed to bring him such joy to do so, and it bothered me. On the way to dinner, he softened for a moment and told us that he had cried the day he filed the divorce papers. He said that Tony had persuade him to divorce Mom. I wondered if it was a lie. It would seem to me that he should have shed more tears than his family moved away, or when his father and Lucy told him he was acting like a fool. All it did was tick him off, but I was happy when Grandpa stood up for us. I had tried to tell my father that his rightful place was with us, although I think he had come to realize that he had taken my mother for granted. He still believed he was meant to be with Tony. I overheard some of his conversations with his family and my mom, and he blamed his error on marrying too young. I believed the biggest mistake of his life was that woman, as Tony was often referred to. Dad had always been so particular about the way other people in his family should treat his children, and I was surprised to witness how badly Tony treated her own. Surely he didn't like the way she talked to them, did he? During conversations with my dad over the telephone, it was impossible not to hear how often Tony yelled at her children, calling them names and screaming at them for the smallest things. There seemed to be an inordinate amount of drama and chaos that revolved around her, and I was confused about what my father could possibly see in that woman. I wanted to believe that he cried when he filed for divorce. Something within me was dying to know that he really did feel some kind of remorse, some sadness for what he had done to our family. I wanted to witness more sorrow within him, enough sorrow that he might consider going back to my mother. Soon after that, however, my father displayed less than remorse. He was rapidly becoming what some people refer to as a deadbeat dad. He fell behind on his $600 a month child support and began visiting us less and less often with each passing month. I overheard my mother's frustrating conversations with him and felt he was only blaming my mother, but also Tony, for his lack of money. All I knew was we felt his absence greatly. With my father gone, I felt like our family was vulnerable to the world and left without protection. That feeling of anxiety was like an insecurity blanket, a black cloud in which we lived, never knowing if things were going to be all right for us, or if we were even safe in our own home. While I trusted my mother to provide us with food and shelter as best as she could, I felt she could not provide for our safety from the terrors of the world. In my eyes, no one would mess with my father unless they were ridiculously foolish. Because of that, I believed he could handle any problem that might come along, if only he could be there more often. So It's crazy that she had such confidence in her father being the protector of the family, but also have this skewed vision of her father also not being the best human being that's out there. So it's kind of like a flip-flop again. Divorce was a hard concept for me to take in. It seemed too final. Every time my father would swing into town, I would seize the opportunity to try to convince him to stay. I was relentless. It would simply not sink in for me that he had any viable reason to want to be away from us. A few times my pleading was effective and he would stay for another day or a few more hours, but in the end it was always short-lived. Certain that I would find his weakness, or should I say guilt mechanism, I would start to beg him to come back to our family, to make it complete again. Deep inside, I knew that he must know that this path with Tony was that was intrinsically wrong. Again, another like long word that shouldn't be there. That's another similarity. Yet on the other hand, I also knew subconsciously that things would not be the same with my mother if he returned. She would probably always carry a grudge for his affairs and resent him for it. I couldn't blame her. I didn't like it when intense jealousy and dislike for Tony welled up inside me. I could only imagine what my mother felt, even though she wouldn't show me any feelings whatsoever. Dad used that same argument with me, that things had changed too dramatically between him and my mom. He would say that there was no hope of going back, and that I needed to get used to it. I wanted to believe with all my heart that he was wrong, that my mother would take him back and things would go back as they were before. From time to time, I could see my father weigh my arguments, considering if I was making any valid points. The fact that he would still contemplate coming home to us was a success for me. It was one step closer to the direction I wanted him to go. Could my arguments be making any headway? Would Mom consider going back to him? One very exciting afternoon, my mother called us into our grandmother's house. "Your father called," she said. Her face looked flushed with more color than I had seen for a long time. "He's on his way up to see us." "Yes," cried Jason and Carrie, delighted in the thought of another visit. It had been too long. My mother shushed them so she could continue. "It looks like we may go back to Yakima. He said he misses us all too much and he's bringing Grandpa Roy's trailer." He looked at her in disbelief, and after the shock wore off, we raced around screaming, hugging each other and jumping up and down in our excitement. Finally, we were going home. All three of us ran to pack our things. It didn't take much time, as most of our stuff was still in boxes. After we were finished, we waited by the door, knowing we were early. Then we waited by the door, certain he would be there any minute. We waited longer, wondering if he'd been in an accident. He should have been there by now. Jason paced the front porch. I was writing in my journal, trying to stay focused on all the things I would do when I got home. Carrie just stood out by the front fence, her eyes searching the road and perking up at every vehicle that rounded the corner and came down our little street. As the sun went down, there was no sign of Dad. Our mother called everyone in for dinner. As we sat around the dining table, my mother spoke, and her voice held none of the warmth and excitement it had just hours before. "Your father's not coming," she said quietly. "He's decided it's best if everything remains the way it is." Profound disappointment, sadness, and anger became etched upon the faces of my family as we all slumped around the table. I wanted to call my father and scream at him. "Look at what you're doing to us. Look at what you're doing to me." Instead, I took another small helping of instant mashed potatoes and shoved all of my emotions down with my food. I couldn't shove the thoughts down, however. An uncomfortable vision raced back and forth in front of my eyes. I was unable to fathom how wonderful Tony must be if my dad was choosing her over a loyal wife and loving children. He had now moved with her twice after leaving us. He may have been torn at times between us, but he felt totally rejected. So again, we hear like of hopes that are dashed, and we hear about like a girlfriend and things like that. So again, I'm not too sure. I haven't really did a huge deep dive quite yet on Keith Jasperson, Melissa Moore's dad. But it sounds like to me that the oblivion was definitely there of who exactly this man was. You can see it. A month or two later, I was playing with my friend Sarah when I saw a man put a sign up in front of the tiny house just 2 doors down from Grandma's house on our side of the street. It said for rent. I ran home to tell Mother about it. She looked into housing assistance and found that we could actually afford it. Within a week or two, we moved into the Nordine house, as we called it, and were delighted to have a place to call our own. The home was similar in size to Grandmother Francis's house, with the exception of the basement. There was none. The tiny house had 2 small, oddly shaped bedrooms. My siblings and I shared the largest room, and the other one was for my mother. My siblings were just as grateful as I was to leave our grandmother's house. To us, it did not matter that we shared a room, or that my sister and I shared a twin bed. Carrie's head would rest at the end of the bed near the footboard and mine at the headboard. I would tickle her feet as she tried to go to sleep at night. It was a comfort to be close to my siblings at that difficult time when everything felt so uncertain. While it seemed strange for us to be in our own, it was also gloriously wonderful, and I felt hope for a better life like I hadn't felt in months. So moving to their own home, having their own place, very awesome. It's very weird that she says my siblings in this little paragraph, because she doesn't refer to them as her siblings. It's usually by name, so that's kind of weird, but okay. One afternoon, we arrived home from school to find a strange vehicle out in front of our new home. It was packed with boxes. Curious, we rushed inside to find my father sitting there. He was all smiles and had a big bear hug for each of us. It had been only 3 months since we had last seen him, but it had felt like years. His presence felt as good as dew on a summer grass. "How long can you stay this time?" asked Jason. We were not prepared as a sloppy grin covered Dad's face. "Forever," he said, and ruffled Jason's hair. I just stared at the man before me, not knowing if I could believe what he just said. Could it really be true? Over the next few hours, I was able to whittle out some information from him. He apparently had reconsidered his life on a most dramatic scale and had realized he couldn't live without us. Saying goodbye to Tony, he had packed up and bought all of his belongings here. Carrie and Jason were beside themselves with joy. My heart leaped too, but I was a little suspicious because of what he had pulled the last time he promised to be with us. Still, I played with him and talked with him and was entirely glad to have him back in our lives for good. After we helped Dad bring all his boxes and belongings into the house, he laid on the couch and talked for hours. Our father was big enough my father was big enough that we would all three lay on him at the same time, and we wouldn't squish him. When he chuckled and laughed, we would bounce right off his body and come back for more. After a while, we settled into a peaceful mood, no one saying much. The question that had been plaguing me all day rose to the surface. "Light brighter." "Dad," I ventured. "Yes, Missy?" "Why exactly did you come back?" My voice was small and it cracked, but I wanted to know. "Well, Melissa," he began, "I had nightmares, over and over again, about letting you kids down. I couldn't be away from you, so I decided to come back." He didn't put forth any further information, so again we laid in silence for a while. It didn't matter how peaceful everything was. I still had to ask the second part of the question, so I would know precisely where we stood and what we were against, if anything. "What happened to Tony?" I asked, wondering if she had anything to do with this. Tony and I are through. It's time that I did right by you. He paused and then gave me a little squeeze. I've missed you, all of you. And I've missed your mom. She's a good woman. And I've been almost completely faithful to her for most of our married lives. He sounded very proud of himself, and I couldn't help the ironic voice in my head that said, I'm sure that if there was a medal of being almost completely faithful, you would believe you deserved it, Dad. I shook the voice away. How many months had I longed for this? To have him home with us again. I certainly wasn't going to ruin it. Still, I observed him carefully. The first several nights, Dad slept in our room as he usually did when he came to visit. One morning, I felt the sunlight play with my eyelids before I opened them. A delicious feeling of oneness surrounded me. Carefully bracing my head on my elbow, I saw Carrie Jason snuggled on the floor next to my dad. I studied his enormous silhouette in the early morning light, and I was confused at the plethora of feelings I was experiencing for him. I loved my father, loved how he provided for us and looked after our physical and emotional needs the best he could, considering the situation he was in. Something was bothering me, however. I was beginning to feel less and less comfortable in his presence. Was it because he had been away from us for so long? Was it because he had broken my trust? Was it because he had been living a different life? Or was it simply a matter of jealousy that I hadn't been a part of it? I hated to admit it, but I knew that I was absolutely envious of Tony. And let me start again. I hated to admit it, but I knew that I was absolutely envious of Tony and the hold she had on him in the past. I was jealous of the time, energy, and money and the love he had spent on her and even her kids. When I felt like his own children and the woman that I knew still loved him were being neglected. I figured that must be most of what he was feeling. But even so, I didn't allow myself to get too close to him. My father had a difficult and unusual smell. Back it up. My father had a different and unusual smell, for one thing, which I couldn't get a mental handle on. It seemed strange, and there was something unusual about his demeanor. It sort of reminded me of how he acted when he was around Grandpa and he pulled the wool over his eyes, like a devious inner chuckle. Somehow the energy was very similar to that, except that there was a bit of added swagger in his manner that I hadn't picked up on before. I naturally assumed that Tony was the reason for it, so I didn't really like it. I had overriding consideration that seemed more important anyway. I was glad Dad seemed confident and happy. I wanted my father to be happy. But more than anything, I wanted him to be with us and to know that he would stay with us. Time flew by quickly, and we got into a routine of having Dad with us again. But by the end of the second week, I could tell something was wrong. He was agitated and anxious, and I couldn't tell exactly what he was thinking, but I know something was up. Once before Mom got home, I overheard him arguing with someone on the phone. Could that be Tony? I couldn't tell, and he wouldn't say. By the end of the weeks, he couldn't handle it anymore. He said he had to leave. At the moment, I could barely drag my feet to the street to say goodbye. To see the boxes packed up ripped my heart into tiny shreds, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. Worse still was to see the helpless, hopeless looks on Jason and Carrie's face, mixed with the deepest sadness I had ever seen. Something switched off inside of them, and I knew what it was. Hope. There was no hope left within them. They looked like empty shells, and they mirrored what I saw in my mother's face. I too was too sad and disappointed in my dad. I just wanted to cry, but another emotion swept over me that was even stronger. I began to burn with a feeling I had never known before. It wasn't just anger, it was intense hatred. I hated Tony like I had never hated anything or anyone before. So at this point, she's blaming her dad's girlfriend, and it's very apparent that none of them fully know the full extent of what is happening yet. But All they know is they want their father here. And again, we still hear that this is such an amazing guy, even though he did the stuff he did in the first chapters. Let's not forget that, okay? Let's just not forget that. Shortly before Christmas in 1990, we're still in 1990, guys. So this all happened within a year and a half of things. So she is now around 10 or 11, I'm supposing, maybe upwards of 12. We were delighted when Grandpa Roy and Lucy called to invite us over to their place for Christmas Day dinner and festivities. To have a normal Christmas, Jason, Carrie, and I were extra hopeful to Mom, so we could leave early enough to spend as long as possible with our cousins. We packed ourselves, our gear, and our meager gifts into Mom's car and headed out for the Yakima area, doing our best not to be impatient with our mother's conservative, unhurried driving. When we got there, the festivities were already in full swing, and we reunited ourselves with the cousins in short order. While it felt like it had been ages since we'd played together, within a few minutes it seemed as if no time had passed at all. The only thing that was out of the ordinary was some hushed conversation from the adults in the far corners of the room. I ignored it, reveling in the moment and praying it would last forever. When Dad showed up suddenly to join the fun, the room went silent. We were glad he was there, but no one had told us he would be coming to see us. Since he had let us down before, we hadn't asked and simply didn't have any expectations. It was easier that way. Dressed in his signature blue jeans and boots, I could tell he had just combed his hair back as his naturally wavy hair rippled lightly when he walked. Carrie got up and ran over to him. Jason and I walked over too, but he took our time since all eyes were on us. I could tell my father's demeanor that things were not well on his end. As the evening progressed, I took him aside and probed him relentlessly for some information. I knew that he and Tony had become driving partners. She had been hired to do over-the-road long hauls with him. For a while, he'd seemed really happy about it. That night, however, he finally admitted that his relationship with Tony was not going well. His job wasn't going well either, and he was quick to let us know that light on. And he was quick to let us know that he'd had to sell his bike and several other possessions to buy us the presents that were in his car. Apparently, he had been able to come up with about $350 from the sale. So as usual, he had lavished us with gifts, including a TV and a VCR for the Nordine house. He even gave my mother some money to take home. Jason and Carrie were ecstatic since we were living without a television at home. But suddenly, instead of feeling grateful, I felt guilty about having anything. Like somehow I didn't deserve it. I wanted Dad to return my stuff so he could get his treasured possessions back. To make matters worse, Grandpa had not told Mom that my father was coming, and he certainly hadn't told Dad that my mother would be there. It was soon apparent that Dad's folks had even tried to create some kind of romantic atmosphere for the two of them. While my dad was happy to see us and pleased that he didn't have to travel to Spokane to do it, he was furious with his father and Lucy for the trick they had played on him. From my experience with my father, he had always seemed rebellious towards his father. That night, however, I felt he was ticked off on principle, and that he would rather die than do anything his father wanted him to do, even if it meant abandoning those who loved him more than life. He and Tony were about through. He had said it himself, but just because my grandfather wanted him to, I felt Dad wouldn't even consider coming back to us. When he left, Dad had the darkest countenance I had ever seen. When he arrived, he had been disponent. Now he was sullen, and his face was dark and clouded like the day when he was angry with us at the ATM that we weren't sure what he was going to do. I felt unsafe, confused, and guilty, like this was somehow my fault. On the way to the car, I couldn't believe that I had been so excited to visit. The wind felt cold and ominous. Usually at the end of a visit, I would want to rush back into the house. I would want to rush back into the house, into the arms of Lucy and Grandpa, and even my dad, loaded down with tainted Christmas gifts in my hand. All I could feel was that I couldn't wait to get out of there. So now we're kind of seeing a shift in the dynamic of what exactly her father means to her after he's walked out now the second time in her life. Be it short-lived, when you're a younger child, especially her being the oldest child, that affected her more than her brother and sister. Still, it's very weird to me that they're still holding him on a pedestal and kind of blaming the girlfriend that he's with as to why he's acting like this. But you very well, again, we go back to those first chapters where they very well know that he is diabolical. Like they have knowledge of this, but they're just like pushing it out of their mind. Now, I'm not saying that they should know that stuff was going on or that he was an active serial killer at that time, because I'm not too sure if he was. I'm pretty sure he was at this time. But to kind of just brush everything off is really wild to me. But that's it. That's all I'm gonna read today, guys. We got through 4 chapters with a little bit of hiccup because I forgot which chapter I had actually read last, but we're back on track. The next chapter is going to be chapter 12. It's called A New Man. Be sure you guys watch all of the videos. Again, once we're done with this book is pretty long. It's about 41 chapters, so that's why I'm going to be doing 4 or 5 chapters in some videos. But be sure you guys are subscribed. Be sure you guys like this video, and remember, every Friday over on my TikTok account I do go live and we do panels. So if you guys have any interesting things you want to talk about the book, definitely send me a DM over on TikTok and we can get you on a panel to talk about it. It's a little bit easier to talk about. But thank you guys so much for watching. Again, also don't forget to subscribe to my podcast, Blurred Lines. That our first episode on that will be coming out the 18th. And that will be some highlights of what we talk about or what we've been talking about. So you guys do not miss that. Again, I am doing a deep dive on Melissa Moore, but it will most likely be the second episode deep dive just because I'm trying to get through this book before I do the deep dive into her. I'm thinking we're gonna deep dive into Ashley Trevino. If you know, you know. If you don't, well, go watch some of my videos and you'll definitely know. But thank you guys so much for being here with me. Again, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.